of homes have been destroyed. And we continue to hear the numbers change, but know that this is going to be a long-term recovery for all of these individuals that have been impacted.
The fact is that I'm totally innocent. I did nothing wrong.
The United States government concedes that it has no evidence that China has ever attempted to date to control the U.S. TikTok platform.
Hello, I'm Nicole Killian in Washington. Tonight on this Friday edition of America Decides, President-elect Donald Trump is sentenced for his New York hush money crimes. The ruling comes just over a week before his inauguration. Trump will now officially enter the White House as a convicted felon.
The people of our country got to see this firsthand because they watched the case in your courtroom. They got to see this firsthand, and then they voted, and I won and got the largest number of votes by far of any Republican candidate in history.
And in Southern California, utter devastation as a picture unfolds of homes destroyed, cars burned out, and at least 10 lives lost. And the winds could fuel the flames for days to come. But first, we start tonight on politics with our Scott McFarlane and Weijia Jiang. Scott, this really was another historic moment for President-elect Donald Trump. Walk us through what happened in the courtroom today.
This is another distinctive legal moment, isn't it? The judge in this case, this New York City case in which Trump became the first president ever convicted of a crime, unconditionally discharged the case, which is a term that means there will be no sentence. There will be no punishment. There will be no jail time, no fine, no probation, no supervised release.
How significant is that?
Well, it's distinctive. These are 34 felony counts. To have nothing attached to them is significant. It's also particularly distinctive to these circumstances. The judge said it's not practical to issue a sentence against a future president because you can't execute that sentence when somebody is president of the United States. And the judge had said previously, Nicole, you can't have that hanging over his head for 4 years waiting for 2029. So the practical impact was we can do nothing to sentence you for these crimes. What's more, the prosecutors, they agreed that was the only disposition possible.
I mean, but for assuming office in a couple of days, do you think the president-elect, if he was an ordinary citizen, would have faced some type of sentence today or penalty?
Because Judge Juan Merchan indicated as much after the verdict and during the trial that these are felonies. We have to respect what the jury said here is you didn't just commit crimes, you committed felonies, which often lead to some form of probation, fines, or prison time. Trump's lawyers very deliberately tried to draw out the clock here and delay these proceedings. And this is a uniquely successful example of that. The time ran out.
And Weijia, I want to turn to you. Obviously, we heard from the president-elect during this sentencing hearing. He appeared virtually. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
It's been a political witch hunt. It was done to damage my reputation so that I'd lose the election, and obviously that didn't work.
I mean, this isn't the first time we've heard such grievances from the president-elect, but what did you make of his comments?
Well, you're exactly right, Nicole. The thrust of his comments really matched what the president-elect has said during any time he's been investigated, whether it's by a special counsel, whether it's by members of Congress. He claims that this was simply a political witch hunt. And in a lengthy statement that he posted on Truth Social, he actually pointed to the sentencing and the fact that this was an unconditional discharge to say that alone proves that there was never a case and this case should never have been brought. But Judge Merchan made very clear in the courtroom that the reason why he received this non-penalty was because of his upcoming presidency and for no other reason. He said if he was a normal citizen, talking about what you just asked Scott, that this would not be the case. He would not have these protections. But in Trump's view, it's a different story, which is why he promises he will appeal. He says that justice will prevail. And he even tried to block what unfolded today, Nicole, in an emergency motion with the New York Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court trying to get this sentencing delayed. Now, that is one issue. In terms of his appeal, there's a very good chance that the case will also go right up to the Supreme Court.
And very briefly weigh in on that, Scott. Why didn't the Supreme Court stop this from going forward?
Their order and rationale was pretty brief. It was just one paragraph. It was a 5-4 decision, so it was a narrow decision. But this was a crime, allegedly, that occurred outside the bounds of the presidency. Presidential immunity should not apply to this, according to the prosecutors, and 5 justices agreed. But that it was 5-4 could be indicative of what's to come during this second Trump term, a Supreme Court which seems very much aligned with President Trump's interests.
And Weege, I want to turn back to you. Obviously, there's a lot going on there in Mar-a-Lago, specifically the president-elect meeting this weekend with House Republicans. What can we expect from those meetings?
So, Nicole, this is part of a series of meetings that Trump is having with Republicans, not only lawmakers, but last night he hosted 22 GOP governors at Mar-a-Lago for dinner because he is laser focused on his agenda and trying to tick off as many boxes as he can in terms of delivering his campaign promises. So we know he's focused on mass deportations, on tax cuts, on energy. But when you're talking about members of the House Freedom Caucus, when they sit down with Trump, they also will have to talk about their priorities. There is a huge opportunity coming up that you both cover so closely with the reconciliation process to get some of those priorities done. But, you know, these conservative members, they're going to want some reassurances that there's going to be spending cuts, especially when Trump has indicated that he wants to raise the debt ceiling. They're going to want to know where these cuts are going to come from, that the government is not going to be spending so much money. And they're going to want to present to Trump their own priorities as well. So there's going to be a lot to talk about. And I think this is really just setting the table for what's to come, what's going to be a very busy time for the both of you on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, well, I guess to that point, very briefly, Weege, while we have you, I mean, how critical are these conversations to advancing the president-elect's agenda, particularly as we see both House and Senate Republicans still seem to be on different pages when it comes to whether or not they should do one bill or 2 bills?
Yeah, that is going to be a big sticking point. We know that Trump has said he wants one big, beautiful bill, but many members that he will be talking to this weekend see it differently, that they don't want to jam too much into just one piece of legislation, and they'd rather see 2 separate pieces. And so I imagine that will be a big part of the conversation. And we'll see where Trump lands on this, because there have been openings where he seems to be flexible. But the bottom line is he's going to express what he wants from these lawmakers. And remember, we've seen time and time again how the Trump factor matters and can matter in races. And so, it'll be interesting to see what will happen for those members who do not comply with what Trump asks of them.
All right, Weege Jiang in West Palm Beach, much warmer than where Scott and I are here in Washington. Thanks to both of you for being with us. In Southern California tonight, those deadly wildfires are still mostly uncontained. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office says at least 10 people have died, and there are new fears that strong winds will persist. Elise Preston joins us now from Santa Monica, California. And Elise, what's the situation on the ground where you are?
Nicole, you're saying there are new fears that strong winds could kick things back up. Right now, winds have died down, and their red flag warning that is in effect. It's expected to expire at 6 p.m. Local time, but in just a matter of days on Monday, there's another red flag warning just staring us right around the corner. So that is expected to kick up an already exhausting firefight even more. We are in Santa Monica, just miles away from the Palisades fire. You can see that in the background. Now, the haze has kind of thinned out a bit where we are, but I can tell you just over that bend and past, once you get in there, is really where you're still seeing that destruction, where neighborhoods look like war zones. Now, here on the Pacific Coast Highway, it is largely closed off to auto traffic. You're only seeing first responder vehicles or people who are responding to the fire in some kind of way. However, we have seen people walking for miles, for hours, to try to get to their neighborhoods and take a glimpse of what is left of their homes. About an hour ago, I overheard a family say, we got to get going. It's a 5-hour walk from here. They're trying to make it there and back before the curfew sets in at 6 p.m. tonight. And authorities are trying to keep looters, they're trying to keep nefarious activity out, and they're also just trying to keep everyone safe because these fires are still burning. This Palisades fire is only 8% contained.
Yeah, simply incredible because as we know there in Southern California, really the best way to get around is car transportation. So to have people walking like that just goes to show how difficult and dire a situation it is. But, you know, you referenced the Palisades fire there, which is one of the largest. It spread so rapidly. You know, how did it grow so quickly and what are some of the biggest issues that firefighters are experiencing there?
So the wind really made a difference here. On Tuesday, on Wednesday, when these fires were really starting to get going, it was hard for them to even put air support up into the air. So you could not get any water drops. You didn't see any planes dropping retardant. It was just too dangerous. It felt dangerous just standing here. Nicole, I know you're no stranger to hurricane force winds. That's what it felt like. But instead of those winds carrying water, they were carrying embers and flames. And that's how they were able to spread so far so quickly. We were in the neighborhood and you're walking and you're seeing homes smoldering, but then you would see embers and you know that you got to jump back because those embers within seconds would burst into larger flames. And so a fire that was put out would then reignite or a new fire would start. And so that has been the case throughout Southern California. We have currently 6 fires burning. And while the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire are incredibly large, incredibly destructive, altogether we've seen about at least 10,000 structures destroyed. That number's only expected to go up. And of course, the worst loss here is that loss of life, and we know 10 people have been killed as a result of these fires.
Yeah, very difficult situation to watch. I'm also no stranger to Southern California, having grown up there. So Elise Preston, we thank you for being out there and encourage you to continue to stay safe. Coming up next, we'll be joined by Senator Adam Schiff of California. We will get the very latest on the wildfires and the federal response. You're watching America Decides. As fire rages in Southern California, questions are starting to be asked about how budget cuts at the state and local level may have impacted the response. President Biden has said the federal government will cover 100% of fire response cost.
They're the worst fires to ever hit Los Angeles, ever. And as soon as these fires broke out, I approved the Fire Management Assistance Grant. I'm also surging all federal resources possible to Southern California.
California Senator Adam Schiff joins us now. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. I know you live in Southern California, and it's been very difficult to see some of these images from afar. But now that you're there, what have you seen and what's being done to get these fires under control?
Well, it's just devastating. Unlike other fires I've seen in the past in California, this one has wiped out whole neighborhoods, whole communities. People's home is gone, their church is gone, their school is gone, their neighbors also have had to flee to shelter, and there's just still no end in sight. I spoke to one firefighter here in the Palisades who wasn't sure he was going to make it out of this fire alive, with fires in front of him, behind him, with water running low, communications down. He told me it was the closest thing to hell that he could imagine.
President Biden has said the federal government will pay for 100% of the California wildfires recovery costs. Let's take a quick listen to the FEMA administrator talking about what that declaration could do immediately.
Some of the immediate things that we can provide to them are to cover the costs that they're incurring as they have been evacuated, helping to support what their longer-term shelter and housing needs are going to be. We can also help support crisis counseling and disaster unemployment.
What do you see as some of the immediate needs on the ground there?
Well, the administration has really moved with enormous speed, not only with the major disaster declaration, but also by covering 100% of the costs of trying to fight these fires. That's an incredibly generous federal match. But there is going to be so much more need in the future because lots of these folks, behind me and other parts of Southern California, didn't have insurance. A lot of insurance companies were canceling their policies, some right up to the beginning of this fire. And these folks are going to need help getting back on their feet, help rebuilding. We're going to have to start, once we put out these fires, being on the watch for mudslides, which often are the next shoe to fall. So we're not through the fires yet. We're not through some of the hardest to come potentially, and we're going to need enormous help in rebuilding.
Yeah, and I guess to that point, as you're well aware, Congress passed about $100 billion in disaster relief at the end of last year. But to your point about the potential for a longer-term relief, do you expect the governor will submit a request for more federal aid? And do you think there is the will in Congress to approve more aid if needed?
I have no doubt that as generous as the federal government has been so far with these emergency declarations and matching funds, we're going to need more. We're going to need a lot more to build. This is the most costly fire disaster, I think, in our state's history, maybe any state's history. So yes, we're going to be coming back to the federal government seeking more. And frankly, if we don't get on top of climate change, if we don't more aggressively attack climate change, every state is going to be in the position that California is in right now, where the disasters are more frequent and more costly. One of the things that's so shocking about this fire disaster is that it's January. We're not used to seeing these kind of fires in January, but if we don't attack this bigger problem of climate change, who knows how long this fire season is going to go in the future.
President-elect Trump has slammed President Biden, Governor Newsom, as well as Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass over the response to these wildfires. What is your reaction? Do you believe that California Democrats in particular have done enough to prepare for these fires and to respond to them?
All of these attacks that are going on now, attacks on the governor, on the mayor, on the state of California, let's get through this disaster. Let's put these fires down. Let's get people to safety. There'll be plenty of time later for the politics of this. But my focus right now is making sure that Californians get the help that they need, that the firefighters who are out here valiantly trying to put down these flames get all the federal support and state and local support they need. Let's focus on the emergency and let's put off the politics of this until some other day.
That being said, though, we know that there have been some concerns expressed about the emergency alert system, concerns about hydrants that don't have water. Obviously, we know that California has been going through a drought, and I understand this may not be the time to finger point, but do you think more could have been done in the run-up to this tragedy to prevent what we're seeing unfold before our eyes?
I'm sure when this is over, we'll do an analysis, a deep study to figure out what do we need to do to prepare and avoid the catastrophic scale of this. There are some now issues, though, in terms of the response. One of them, I was on the phone with the Secretary of Homeland Security just an hour ago, and that is some of the alerts going out are wrong. Some of the alerts are going out talking about evacuations where evacuations are not needed. That's a real now problem, and we have to fix that. And at this point, it's still unclear whether this is a problem within FEMA and its technology, whether it's a problem with the telecommunication carriers and cell towers that were down that are going up and delayed messages that are going out, or whether this is potentially some external bad actor. We don't know, but we need to get to the bottom of it. We need to fix this problem, which is breeding distrust in government and distrust in the response. And other things, we need to make sure that when legitimate evacuation orders go out, that people are paying attention and following them, because otherwise we're going to lose more lives.
And then lastly, I know you talked very briefly about issues of climate change, certainly issues with respect to insurance, but now in your role as senator, what additional steps do you think need to be taken specifically on the federal level to deal with massive natural disasters like this?
Well, the insurance issue is a huge one. It was a huge one before this catastrophe. This catastrophe is only going to aggravate that problem of people not being able to get coverage, not being able to afford coverage. I've introduced legislation in the past to establish a federal backstop reinsurance facility like we did with terrorism risk reinsurance to try to bring down some of the insurance costs that consumers. Whether we use that approach or some other, though, we need to make sure that people can afford insurance and protect what is generally the most valuable personal possession people have, and that's their home.
All right. Well, Senator Adam Schiff, we thank you so much for your time, and certainly our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Southern California today.
Thank you so much. You take care.
The president-elect was sentenced in his New York criminal case today. Reaction from his former White House attorney, who asked the Supreme Court not to stop the sentencing from occurring. You are watching America Decides. President-elect Donald Trump says he is going to appeal his conviction in the New York criminal hush money case after being sentenced without any penalties. Ty Cobb joins us now to discuss. He was formerly a member of the Trump administration's legal team. He is also a former federal prosecutor. Mr. Cobb, thanks so much for being with us. This sentencing, as you know, included no jail time, probation, or fines for the president-elect, but he can't own a gun and he must provide a DNA sample for New York's crime data bank. What is your reaction to this sentencing, and do you believe justice was served?
That's a very difficult question, particularly with regard to this case. This case, unlike the two federal cases, which were serious cases and well-founded in the law, this case was always subject to significant criticism for the way it was constructed and pursued, and with good reason. I think this case may not survive on appeal, but what was at issue today was not the legality of the indictment or the validity of the charges, but was the opportunity to honor and perfect the verdict of 12 jurors who were unanimous that Trump had committed 34 felonies, and in their judgment, was guilty and needed to be sentenced. The sentencing perfects his conviction. It permanently puts him in the ranks of convicted felons. And it also triggers his appellate rights, which I think, a year or more down the road will likely result in overturning of this conviction. But even if it does not, it doesn't undermine what the jury did. The jury did their duty and found him guilty, and today he stands guilty as charged.
You and other members of the nonprofit group State Democracy Defenders Action filed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court asking the justices not to stop this sentencing. Why was it important for it to go forward?
Well, it was important to go forward because, as we've seen, Trump rail against the legal system, the rule of law, every legal institution from, state courts to federal courts to the Supreme Court. It was important to reinforce the significance and the dominance of the rule of law in America, and to try to restore the concept, which has been dinged up a little bit, that no one is above the law. There was no legal basis, in my view, and in the view of the majority of the Supreme Court justices, for pausing the sentencing. I think Trump's complaints were largely political and personal, but did not really have a legal basis. And I think it was very important that the court act according to the law and permit the sentencing to go ahead as it did.
I mean, at this point, the president-elect is facing no penalty, as we said, from this trial. His other two federal cases involving January 6th, as well as the classified documents, has been dropped. And of course, the prosecutor in the election interference case in Georgia has been disqualified. I mean, at this point, could he face any further legal repercussions, or is this all behind him now?
So it's largely behind him. The only potential legal repercussions would be in the Georgia case. The two federal cases are, dead and over. I'm sure that he will quickly pardon his two co-defendants in the Florida case, and that case will be totally dead and over. But with regard to the Georgia case, he doesn't really have any control over that. On the other hand, as you point out, Fani Willis has been disqualified for her ethical lapses and misconduct, and they have to restart that if they so choose. They say they will, but we shall see. I think that case also suffers in terms of its construction, and I doubt that the case as charged ever gets to trial. But certainly as to the president, it's not going to go to trial for at least the next 4 years, in my view. Although there's no dominant rule or case law that dictates that. The policy of the Justice Department in federal cases is that a president can't be criminally prosecuted while in office, and I think that policy will be extended to the civil case should the Georgia courts try and do anything.
All right, Ty Cobb, thank you so much.
Yes, my pleasure, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
The last jobs report of 2024 surpassed economists' expectations. According to the Labor Department, employers added 256,000 jobs to the U.S. economy last month. The unemployment rate also ticked down slightly to 4.1%. The president released a statement saying, quote, "We have created over 16.6 million jobs over the course of my administration, and this is the only administration in history to have created jobs every single month." Elected officials in California are facing criticism over their response to the devastating wildfires. How these fires could potentially impact their political futures. You're watching America Decides. At least 10 people are dead and over 300,000 people have been ordered or warned to evacuate as wildfires continue to devastate parts of Southern California. Some residents have been quick to blame Democratic leaders in the state, including Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. Let's turn now to Democratic strategist Mariel Saez and Republican strategist Matt Gorman. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Mariel, I want to start with you by listening to a clip from our own Jonathan Vigliotti, who questioned Mayor Bass earlier this week.
Mayor, LA County is in a panic state. For several hours, we watched as hundreds of homes in a neighborhood burned to the ground. We did not see a single fire engine. There was fear and there was a lot of confusion. Shortly after the fire started, a press release was put out warning of this fire behavior. My question to you is, what explains this lack of preparation and rapid response?
Let me just say, first and foremost, my number one focus, and I think the focus of all of us here with one voice, is that we have to protect lives, we have to save lives, and we have to save homes. We will absolutely do an evaluation to look at what worked, what didn't work.
Obviously, we know President-elect Trump has been quite critical, not only of the mayor, but also Governor Newsom as well, putting out a number of posts on Truth Social and talking to some of us reporters earlier this week on Capitol Hill. But is there some validity to some of this criticism that these leaders are facing, and particularly when we're talking about someone like Governor Newsom, who appears to have higher, potentially presidential ambitions? Could this be a black eye for him in the future?
Well, certainly there's going to be time for reflection and an examination of the immediate response. But right now, you know, the hard work of containing fires, saving lives, consoling the survivors is first and foremost. And so I think what we want to see from our leaders right now is both empathy, but also action. And you're seeing that from the federal government, the state and local coming together. You saw President Biden on the ground, you've seen him immediately approve major disaster declaration, deploy federal resources, coordinate across states, also bringing in partners from Canada. So really a whole of government exercise to contain fires, to save lives. And we need to see that continue in the days and weeks to come. We also have to remember this is going to be a very difficult and long recovery for the residents. They've lost lives, homes, churches, schools, also a sense of peace and security. And so I think it's important for the president-elect and incoming administration to understand and acknowledge that this is going to also fall on their shoulders. It's going to be important to work with those state and local partners to see the residents through this absolute tragedy. And then, doing the important work of examining the response and improving it going forward.
Yeah, Matt, at the same time, the president-elect did say that he would be willing to work with the leaders of California once he takes office. But that being said, we've oftentimes seen some of these major natural disasters get politicized, most recently with Hurricanes Helene. Does the president-elect need to tone it down a bit?
Well, again, we're playing their game now. This is the same administration with Kamala Harris trying to play campaign games with Ron DeSantis, talking about phone calls in the middle of a campaign, where this is also the same administration who many times during, God forbid, terrible mass shootings, who have absolutely no problem politicizing it, talking immediately while things are still happening on the ground about the politics of it and what needs to be done. So I have zero sympathy for this administration, whether they're in California or in Washington, because we're now playing by their game. So we're going to be talking very much so that the critical response that Karen Bass had when she was down in Ghana had to be shamed back. Gavin Newsom having no idea in an interview with CNN about what the effects were, about there was no water coming out of the hydrant, saying the local people are dealing with that. And again, when Joe Biden was in the state yesterday talking about the response, but then pivoting and saying, well, the good news is I am a great-grandfather now. So the response has been completely out of touch, and they're going to be held accountable for that. And in many ways, what we've seen now is years of bad policy, candidly, whether that's with the proposition that they passed allowing for more reservoirs to be built, nowhere built. The insurance laws and regulations that have really hampered the market in this state and will hurt it as they rebuild. It's unfortunately now coming to pass, and it's a very terrible scenario.
And turning gears a little bit, obviously, in terms of the president-elect, obviously the other big story of the day, of course, being his sentencing. Considering he's not going to face any penalties in this hush money case and pretty much all these other cases appear to be behind him, does this embolden the president-elect politically as he prepares to take office later this month?
I don't think it makes much of a difference. I believe very firmly that this whole last year, if you were talking about 2020 or any events in the past like that, in not talking about what voters are in the future, you were missing out. And I think, look, this is now done. It is set aside, whether the case is against him or now this. Let's just focus on what he's going to take office on. He's going to take office on trade, immigration, and the like. I think he and others will do well about focusing on that and not something in the past.
Yeah, and Marielle, what do you think we can expect come day one? Obviously, we know the president-elect this weekend is meeting with a number of different House Republicans, House Freedom Caucus committee chairs, and others. But when he was on Capitol Hill earlier this week with respect to reconciliation, he kept saying, well, I could do one or two, which is different from earlier this week where he also said he wants one big, beautiful bill. So, kind of where do you see things going from a policy and legislative standpoint to lay the ground for him when he takes office on the 20th?
Sure. Well, the president-elect was really elected on his promise to lower costs for the American people. And as we start to see conversations unfold within the Republican caucus with the incoming administration, the focus has really not been on that issue. It's been on how much can we cut government spending? How much can we cut these critical programs that Americans rely on in order to pass and pay for tax cuts for the wealthy at the end of the day? And so, I think Matt's right. The president-elect has an opportunity to come in and do the people's business, but, he's working with really slim margins, a very tight majority in both the House and the Senate. We're going to see these conversations unfold, but unfortunately, they're not really focused at all on the priorities they laid out in their campaigns and their promises to working people.
Matt, very briefly, do you think the longer they deliberate on this 1 versus 2 track that this is going to slow down the president-elect's agenda in any way?
No, he hasn't even taken office yet. So the 100-day clock hasn't even started. What I'm more focused on, honestly, is, look, Thune clearly wants 2. Johnson, with a slim margin, wants to get as much done as possible with 1. That is, I think, what's going to be key is who is he listening to? Who ultimately wins this little internecine battle? That's what's going to tell me as we go forward in reconciliation between the 2.
And yes or no, because we're looking ahead at confirmation hearings next week. Does he get all of his nominees through?
Barring right now, the answer is yes.
All right, Matt Gorman, Marielle Sayas, we thank you so much for being with us. Will popular social media app TikTok go dark in the U.S.? What the Supreme Court justices are saying about whether a ban should take effect. You are watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The Supreme Court seems likely to uphold a law that would ban TikTok in just 9 days. The justices appear to agree that the app's links to China are a national security threat. The bipartisan law gave TikTok's China-based parent company 9 months to sell it or face a potential ban. That is set to take effect 1 day before President-elect Trump's inauguration. We are joined now by CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. And Jan, you were at the Supreme Court today. I mean, what did you make of today's proceedings?
Well, I mean, it was pretty extraordinary. 2.5 hours. That's the long argument for the justices, very engaged. But I agree. I mean, I think the clock is ticking for TikTok. The justice is clearly concerned and sensitive to these national security concerns that you mentioned, which is what drove Congress to pass this law, that TikTok's parent company, which is based in Beijing, is gathering data on 170 million American users that China could get access to, one of our adversaries. And also, they're concerned that China could manipulate the kind of information that Americans see, and Americans wouldn't even know about it. So the justices were, I think, troubled by those concerns. Now, TikTok, of course, presented a pretty robust argument that there are First Amendment issues here, and a lawyer for the influencers, and of course, people make millions of dollars on this platform, influencers. They argue that they have free speech rights to be able to use whatever social media sites that they choose, and that the law violates the First Amendment. But I think that was a pretty hard row for these justices to kind of follow. And I think, we'll see. But like I said, I agree with you. It wasn't looking that great for TikTok.
Yeah, well, let's take a quick listen to Chief Justice John Roberts, who had this to say.
Are we supposed to ignore the fact that the ultimate parent is, in fact, subject to doing intelligence work for the Chinese government?
Now, obviously, he sounds pretty skeptical there, but...
Yeah, that was right at the beginning of the argument, too. I mean, like one of the first questions, he went right at it, framing this as a real national security concern. And later in the argument, the Chief Justice said, Congress in this law, which, of course, President Biden signed, bipartisan support, isn't saying TikTok has to stop. It's just saying that the Chinese government has to stop controlling TikTok. In other words, find a U.S. buyer, and, Congress doesn't care what people post on TikTok, what cat videos they watch. Yeah, but is that possible in the
next 9 days?
That's what I think may be the exit strategy, that right there. There's a provision in the law that you can get a 90-day extension. So I see and the president could grant it. I see a possibility that the court could enter a brief pause that would give TikTok a little more time to find a U.S. buyer. So it wouldn't go dark next Sunday, and it will give them a little more time.
And we know, obviously, the president-elect has asked the court to block this ban. Is there anything potentially that he could do once he takes office to reverse this law if it's upheld?
I don't know that he could reverse it. I mean, I guess he could always try to say, I'm not going to enforce it. I don't think so. I think the more likely scenario, though, is that he would kind of trigger that 90-day extension that's written into the law already. It gives the president that authority if he thinks there may be something in the works. And we've already seen Trump, who, opposed TikTok initially, but now he says he likes it, say, he wants a little more time, too, because maybe he can make a deal.
Yeah, and I was going to say, give us a sense of the timetable here. I mean, if we do see some type of pause to give TikTok a little bit more time, if you will. I mean, ultimately, when do you think
that won't
the court?
Take long. Yeah,
when do you think the court could rule?
Soon. I mean, probably not today or this weekend, but I would expect something soon. In the coming days. Certainly before the end of the week, next week.
All right. Well, certainly a case that a lot of people are watching.
170 million users. Yeah.
No pressure. No pressure
no.
for the High Court. Well, thank you so much, Jan Crawford, for joining us. We really appreciate it. Former President Jimmy Carter left an impact far beyond the White House. But what about the lasting impact of his presidential campaign strategy on Washington politics? We'll take a closer look at that next on America Decides. A political who's who attended former President Jimmy Carter's state funeral this week. That includes several presidents who were elected by emulating his dark horse campaign strategy. CBS News' Lindsay Reiser breaks down exactly how a Georgia peanut farmer won the nation's most powerful office roughly half a century ago.
Jimmy Carter and his team knew the 1976 primary season would be different because of changes made following the 1968 election when Democrats lost by 110 electoral votes after a messy primary. So, to prevent party bosses from picking candidates behind closed doors, delegates would now be appointed based on a proportion of how many votes a candidate received. So, a candidate could still gain delegates even if they came in third in the state. And at the same time, Iowa moved to become the first in the nation election because its caucus took so long to organize. Carter decided to use these two changes to create a winning strategy. The year before the election, he campaigned in 250 cities across 40 states, and he aimed to get as many votes as possible in every single state instead of just winning all the delegates in a few big ones and ignoring the rest of the country. And he and his team also heavily invested in Iowa at a time when most major candidates ignored the Hawkeye state. But Carter knew that winning over Iowans would give him the media clout he needed for momentum. And sure enough, the media blitz came fast after his Iowa victory. Now, despite starting with no name recognition in a crowded field of 17 Democrats and having significantly less money than some of his opponents, Carter had more than 1,500 delegates a month before the convention. So his tactic of concentrating on gaining delegates in every state was a core reason why. For example, he lost in states like Massachusetts, New York, and Oregon. But as you can see there, he still picked up delegates in those states because he achieved a high enough vote total to get some. Add all the small gains along with delegates from victories in places like Texas and Michigan, and you get a presidential nominee. Now, Carter's dark horse victory revolutionized primary campaigns. Future presidents have used it to great success. Fellow Democrat Barack Obama shocked the political establishment with his Iowa win, and he used that momentum to succeed in other primary states while gaining delegates in the races he lost, ultimately propelling him to the presidency just like Carter. And the strategy also worked for President Donald Trump in 2016. He lost Iowa, but won every other early state before Super Tuesday, which helped supercharge the political narrative around him. And that is what helped keep him in the neck-and-neck race for delegates with Senator Ted Cruz until Trump ultimately came out on top.
Very fascinating. Lindsay Reiser, thank you. Well, that does it for us. But before we go, we have spent this week remembering the life and legacy of our 39th president, Jimmy Carter. And so we'd like to leave you with some final words from those who knew and admired him. The Daily Report's up next.
But his life was also a broader love story about love for his fellow humans.
A great man who did a lot for this country and really showcased a true model of leadership.
He sought to take to the White House what was in him.
He did Habitat for Humanity and the Bible study for kids.
Why do you think that's important?
So that other kids can grow up to be more like him.